This is Storyboard. Dance, dance, dance to the music. Let's dance, dance, dance to the music. Oh, man.
Oh,
I can never tell.
I love that music you made.
Oh, thank you. I tend to enjoy it, too.
Oh, it's pretty awesome.
Hey, I'm Zach.
I'm Jameson.
How you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. It's been a wonderful week.
Yes, it has. 4th of July week.
Right? 4th of July you guys will be getting this just after 4th of July.
On the 5th of July.
Ooh.
We're time travelers.
We are time travelers. This is a time capsule for 2 days from now.
Open it with caution.
Or anybody who opens it after then.
You might receive a sound hug.
Ooh. Welcome back, people, to this wonderful podcast. Today we're going back into the world of Castaways.
Whoa! Week 2 of Castaways. How exciting.
I know, right? I mean, I don't know. I feel like my favorite so far was my second week of Eternity Found, so I think you'll quite enjoy this one.
I hope so.
I know, you're more set into your story and what you're doing with it, so.
Yeah, it's no longer an experiment to do these podcasts. It feels like it's sort of natural now. We sort of know what we're doing.
Uh-huh.
We have 2 mics set up finally.
Ooh, we're hopefully going to make it sound a little bit better. So.
Yeah, hopefully.
Still have a little echo to it because this room's not entirely padded. But hey, what can you do?
It's best to spar when not totally padded.
Uh-huh. So, what did we talk about last time?
Well, last time we talked a little bit about the world of Castaways as a whole. We talked about some of the quirks, a little bit of the islands. We've talked a little bit about the deities in the world of Castaways. We talked about how it's on Neptune. So just a good sort of a base foundation of Castaways world.
Mm-hmm.
Today we're going to delve into, you lucky ducks, you're going to get 2 stories today.
2 stories?
2 stories. We're going to delve into one of the characters of Castaways who was introduced to all of you last time by the name of Robin. Yeah, Jim's dad. We're going to talk a little bit about him. We're going to talk a little bit about his life, the man, the myth, the legend.
And quite the legend he is.
Oh, yeah. He's pretty awesome. Especially since he doesn't actually appear in the rest of the book.
Yeah, it's kind of sad.
But that doesn't mean you can't have stories about him.
It's true.
That doesn't mean that I won't write stories about him.
Uh-huh.
They just won't be part of the novel, Castaways.
You guys have kind of seen what happens to him, or heard.
Yeah. Seen with your ears. Robin is a pretty interesting fellow.
Yeah.
He was a fisherman during his time on Earth. But, we're not really going to talk about the time on Earth. But he's a bigger fellow, about 6'3". He's got nice dark hair. He always keeps it well trimmed. He's got a nice beard as well. That just full beard, nothing patchy about it at all. Just a classy looking gentleman.
Like that kind of guy that you look at and you look at his beard and you're just like, yeah, that's it right there.
I see you copied my beard. But Robin wasn't born on Earth.
Really?
Nope, he was born in Atlantis a long time ago, because time flows differently there than it does here.
Ooh.
All you have to do is look at the patterns of how years pass by in the orbits of the planets around the sun.
Oh, so does it mean time travels slower there or quicker?
A little bit of both sometimes, but mostly slower.
Okay.
But sometimes quicker. It's so weird. It's a different planet. We're not sure what happens. But Robin was born to a mom and a dad who loved each other very much.
The birds and the bees.
We're not talking about that here.
Oh. Children, ask your parents about it. Don't ask
Don't
us.
tell them we sent you.
Don't tell them we sent you. But just don't ask us about it.
We don't want those questions.
We don't want those questions.
But he was born during a time on Atlantis where there was no water yet. So that ritual that we talked about last time with the Order of the Perfection, cutting open their guts and spilling out their entrails and introducing water into the world, hadn't happened yet. He lived a pretty regular life. Him and his family went to worship on their respective days, worshiping the land. They were devout worshipers of the land, about protection, about stability, about just being grounded. It's a horrible pun, but that's their theology is staying firm in the face of anything that might be thrown their way.
Oh, and does he pretty much exemplify that? That's for sure.
Oh yeah, he very much does. In so much that during his time in this church, he starts to rise in the ranks. Until eventually, many years pass. Eventually, he becomes one of the main figures in this church, one of the main theological figures. And he goes around, he spends all his time just going out and preaching the good word of the ground, the land.
The good word of the land.
Have you heard about the flat thing underneath your feet? Please let me tell you about it. And he goes about just protecting people. He's the type of guy that he walks down the street, he sees a homeless fellow, and he talks to him, helps him out a little bit. And during one of his escapades, he hears tell of a shady group going around, which we introduced last week, the Order of Perfection. And he decides that he's going to figure out what's going on with them. He spends a long time traversing throughout the whole planet and finds their headquarters.
Ooh.
And decides that he's going to do a little bit of espionage work. And so he goes in there, he figures out what they're doing and what they're trying to bring to pass. This is roughly a year before the ritual is actually performed.
Oh.
And so he decides with his newfound knowledge that they're going to bring about water, and he has no idea what water is. He decides to spend a lot of that time on his own. So he goes to a mountain that may or may not be one of the islands later, that
Ooh.
may or may not be the island that Jim himself lands on when he comes to this world.
The Castaways Island.
The Castaways Island. He goes there and he spends this whole entire year in constant meditation. He'll only stop to eat and drink when needed. And during this time, he forms a connection with the ground that had never been formed before. The ground reaches out to him and gave him power.
See, I have nightmares about the ground reaching out to me and like grabbing me, but I've never imagined it being so nice.
Yeah. You know when in the nightmares when the hands pop out of the ground?
Mm-hmm.
And how they grab onto your legs and start dragging you down?
Yeah.
They're just trying to hug you better.
Oh, ground hug.
Ground hug. Rhymes with the sound hug. So he gains these powers from the ground. It's pretty amazing. He knows he has powers, but he doesn't know what they are. He does know, however, that he has a title to go with his new powers. And that title is Castaway.
Dun, dun, dun.
Wow.
The title of the title is the title.
It's the titular title given to the titular character's pappy.
Me papi.
Hello, pappy.
Hello, Pop.
So, with this title, he becomes the very first castaway. They have to start somewhere. Especially since there wasn't water at this time. He was the first one. He was the rule breaker. He was the one that just started the ground giving powers to people. So, he goes off of this mountain, knowing that he has power, and he starts to go towards where he knew the ritual was going to be taking place. It was a temple in a darkened portion of the city of Atlantis. There were dark magics going on there. I mean, the Order of Perfection was not a great thing. Mm-hmm. And he gets to the building, and he walks in just as he sees the last of the Order of Perfection slice open their chest all the way down and sees the introduction of water into this world.
That's got to be terrifying.
Yeah, it was a little much for him. He was like, what is this? I've never seen this substance before in my life.
Suddenly walk in. What did I just walk in on?
You know, maybe we should just leave them to it.
I just... You just keep doing what you do, guys. I'm just going to go out of here.
He didn't have that chance, though, to get out of there.
Ah.
It gushed forth. Water started gushing forth. And to give you an idea of what this room is like, it's a massive ark. Not the boat. And it only had the one entrance where he came in, where Robin came in.
Keep in mind, this is very Roman-inspired-esque design.
Mm-hmm.
Or the Romans were more inspired by this design.
They were. I'm definitely not getting the idea from the Romans. It was from them first.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And so Robin's seeing what's going on here, seeing this massive gushing forth of water. He didn't know that water was a substance that you can't really touch or like hold in place. He holds out, he braces himself, gets his arms and hands ready, and he just pushes against it, and the water stops. So it's still gushing out of these entrails, and he's holding on, and he's pushing against this water, and the room begins to fill up. And it gets to the roof and tries to start cracking everything else, but it has nowhere to go. And he's holding it, and he's holding it, and he keeps on doing so, and he does so for quite some time.
So part of the power he gained from the earth is the ability to hold back the element of water.
He can touch it as though it were a solid. How slick is that?
That is pretty cool.
So, eventually he realizes, however, that he cannot stop this flood. He's held it back for a good 2 weeks.
Ouch.
Yeah. People can't survive without water for more than 3 days, they say. He's good on that part.
He held against water for 2 weeks.
He held against for 2 weeks. So he starts letting it go slowly but surely by taking a step back at a time. Just holding it and holding it. Until he eventually, after a couple days of walking backwards and holding this flood back, he runs into someone and tells them, "Get to high ground."
I've been holding this thing for 2 weeks.
I've been holding it in for 2 weeks.
And that is the origin of that saying.
You're in for a real treat.
I can't hold it back anymore. It's just going to go.
Oh, man. Yep. So Robin becomes a living legend in this place. He becomes known as the first castaway. He's the one that held back the world flood, and was able to get most of humanity to safety by sending a messenger.
As much as could fit on the islands, at least.
Mm-hmm. Which was a decent portion.
These islands are pretty big. They're not just dinky little hills sticking out of the water.
I love the word dinky.
Dinky.
Dinky. So, there is the origin of castaways. That's where they come from, as the land decided it needs to preserve. It decided it needed to embody its own ideals and help out people against the flood. And that's why the castaways are such a slow-to-act organization. Because they want to only hold back the flood. They want to preserve what land is there and to preserve those people.
They're the opposing deification against the water. Mm-hmm. There's a natural aggression there.
Yep, but there's also a balance. An odd balance. I mean, if the land tries to encroach, the water fights back, especially the deep. The deep really fights back. If the deep tries to fight, which it always does, the land fights it. And the castaways fight it. So, one thing we did forget to mention, though, about this story is Robin eventually gets tired.
Well, you'd assume after 2 weeks of holding the entire ocean back.
Yep. And he gets swept away. And during being swept away, the water hits a portion of like a street or a building and whirlpools. And during that whirlpool, he falls into the direct center and ends up on our world.
Dun, dun, dun.
So that's how he gets there. He meets his wife. They have a great time and have a wonderful little boy that they just adore. And then his wife gets horribly murdered.
Oh, didn't he have a wife on the other side? Or did I mishear that?
No wife on. Well, he had parents on the other side.
Parents. Okay.
Parents on the other side.
Okay, that's sorry.
Meets his wife on this side.
So he meets his wife on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Has a child.
And is constantly he figured out that whirlpools are the gateways between the world. And so he constantly travels back and forth, has a lot of time passing, and eventually gets to England in the 1910s, where we first meet him.
Awesome.
So there you go. That's the story of the first castaway. That's Robin Crusoe. We'll tell you more about his son, Robinson Crusoe, Jim Cruise. It's just sort of a fun little nod. So let us know if you have any questions about him. Let us know if you want to know more about castaways, maybe about their powers.
And remember, you can submit your questions to StoryboardPod@gmail.com.
That's StoryboardPod
@gmail.com. Or you can also join our group, The Bryte Side, on Facebook. The Bryte Side is a host of many different features. It's growing, and it is producing most of these podcasts that are coming out. Hopefully we'll have more for you in the future. It's in the details and the work right now. But for right now, we're on to your questions.
So we actually do have a question today.
Yes, we do. And it comes from our ever-faithful listener,
Arlene, thank you for writing again.
Hello, gentlemen. Another
Hello.
question for you, this time about castaways. What are all of the islands' names? Are they all linked to a specific landmass on Earth? Which islands are linked to which landmasses? Thanks, Arlene96.
Perfect. All right, so great question, Arlene. In answer to it, yes, the islands are named. Yes, they are linked, and we will tell you which ones they are linked to. So as a review, there are 5 different islands linked to the 5 major land masses of the world. What are the islands, Jameson?
So first off, we have kind of a barren island where the father, as we explained, Robin, goes and gets his power at. The island that we will come to know in the story. And it is currently nameless because not many people reside there.
As in, maybe 1 or 2 at a time.
Mm-hmm. Then, next, we have a steampunk island. This place is called Rookhold.
Now, Rookhold is a pretty amazing place. We talked a little bit about it last week, but it is linked to Asia and Europe, so Eurasia. It's one of the bigger islands because of the size of those land masses. Oh, and Nameless is linked to Antarctica. We forgot to say that.
Oh, yeah. I was just naming them all. But
yep. Antarctica has there's like no one there. So it makes sense to have it linked there.
Mm-hmm. And then next, we have Utopia.
Utopia was that walled island that we talked about last week with the Minotaurs and the labyrinth in it. It is linked to Africa.
And next in the list, we've got the Moving Island.
The Moving Island is pretty amazing. It's probably my favorite of the islands because it's a lion turtle. Just gonna come out and say it. It's a lion turtle. It's pretty cool. The Moving Island is called Wayfarer because it goes around everywhere. It is linked to Australia, mate. Then lastly, we have the island that is of the people that worship the deep. It is called Deserted. It's not a deserted island, contrary to its name. And it's linked to the Americas. So.
Now, remember, as we stated last time, these islands do not represent the cultures of the land masses, but the land masses themselves.
They are much more linked to size than anything about it.
Because these cultures existed a long time before the cultures on Earth.
Mm-hmm. So, there you have it. There's hopefully a great answer to your question. Thank you so much again, Arlene, for writing them in.
And remember, you can send in your questions at StoryboardPod@gmail.com or join our Facebook group once again at the Bryte Side.
I like joining Facebook goops.
Facebook goops. Now comes our favorite portion of the podcast. You get a very special treat. Last time you got the prologue. This is Chapter 1 of Castaways.
Jim? A soft voice permeated the quiet air of the orphanage as Jim's bunkmate, Peter, barely 4 years old, reverently poked Jim's side. Jim moaned quietly but rolled over. He liked Peter enough, but sleep was so beautifully intoxicating. Sleep's sweet caress began to overtake him again, but like a rhinoceros in a glass figurines and antiquities shop, Peter jabbed Jim's face with small, non-coordinated fingers. Ouch! Jim yelped, sitting straight up in bed, and then hitting his head on the top bunk, yelped again. His eyes began to focus, as well as his annoyance, on a very freckled, ginger boy. Peter, Jim groggily mumbled, rubbing his head. It's the middle of the night. What do you think you're... I'm scared, Jim. Peter's small voice interrupted, sounding very frantic. You were, and then there was... I was dreaming again, wasn't I? Yes, and then you were... Jim noticed what Peter was talking about. He was jittery. He was drenched in sweat. He dreamed that horrible dream again. Images started flashing across his mind, horrible, nasty things. His father, the boat, and most of all the horse. That terrible, horrible creature seemed to be everywhere now. As Peter began another one of his 4-year-old fear-induced ramblings, Jim pulled the small child into a firm embrace more for his comfort than the child's, and looked at the familiar sight of 5 other bunks all crammed into an extremely small room. Like the animals on a train car, each bunk was occupied by an orphan who was slowly waking to the unexpected outburst.
"And then there were the horses."
"What?" Jim whispered intensely.
"The horses in my dream I was telling you about. They were made of water, Jim."
Jim started, awake, terrified. Images of that horrible night pushed intently on his mind as if they could push themselves into reality. Jim fought to hold them back. "Not tonight," Jim thought as Peter began to sob in his arms. "Go to sleep, Peter. It was only a dream," Jim said while placing the smaller boy back onto his upper bunk. "Everything will be all right in the morning." "Okay, Jim," Peter replied, his eyes, as well as his voice, drooping due to exhaustion. "Good night." "Good night." Jim watched intently as Peter's breathing became regular, then stepped back down to his bunk. He laid down and stared intensely at the bunk above him and didn't catch a wink of sleep the whole night long. The orphanage was a dingy 2.5-story building falling apart from top to bottom. The roof's patch job was horrendous, so when it rained, the denizens of the honorary 3rd floor, hereafter to be known as the attic, got a good soaking. Light barely filtered in the room from that small hole in the roof, as the cramped, rectangular room had no windows. The boys on the bottom bunks had life easy, for their only restriction was the bunk above them, while the boys on the top bunk slept cozied up against the roof, a feat only the smaller boys could do. The boys were crammed up there to teach them frugality and living within their means. The floor below the boys was where the girls were. Jim had only seen that room once, and he was amazed at how nice it was. The room was notably brighter because of the window at the far end. Each of the girls had their own bed and space around them. Jim had forgotten about personal space and marveled at why anyone would need it. After seeing the floor only once, Jim had come to one conclusion: girls are spoiled and rotten. Wake-up call came about 5 minutes after the sun showed itself and was always brought by, in Jim's opinion, the nicest lady ever to walk this earth, Mrs. Lentley. Mrs. Lentley was an ancient lady compared to the boys, being the ripe old age of 56. Despite her age, she was plump and full of smiles. Mrs. Lentley was also the orphanage's maid. Her hair had wisps of gray, but still retained its deep brown color. Her eyes were the same color of brown, and despite the room being so dark, always maintained a twinkle of mischief. Whenever a smile graced her face, it brought with it 2 ginormous dimples right in the center of her cheeks. Her voice perfectly matched her exterior, a thick Cockney accent. Even though she was a missus, Jim knew that she had never been a girl. She was just too nice. Mrs. Lentley always began her rounds at the bunk just to the right of the door, and ended with Jim's and Peter's bunk at the end of the room. She would greet each child by name, and then ever so politely say to the full room,
"It's time to get up, wash up, and go downstairs to breakfast. You know how Mrs. Cratchit doesn't like to wait."
Then when Jim would pass her, she always added a little extra.
"Honestly, I don't know why people who dislike you little buggers would ever open an orphanage,"
she added today, completely straight-faced. Then, seeing Jim's incredulous look, burst out in a good, hearty laugh.
"Come now, Jim, just a good-natured joke to brighten your day."
Jim didn't so much as crack a smile, and so Mrs. Lentley's smile faded as she realized what was going on.
"Another rough night, then,"
she whispered, her voice filled with compassion. Jim just nodded.
"It'll be all right, son. Everything'll work out."
A nod again. Mrs. Lentley sighed as she watched the boy head out of the room to get ready with the others. She had been around too long to dismiss Jim's nights as a childish fear, but on the other hand, had no idea what to do with it. Then she saw it. Jim's book was open on his bed. She had always been curious of the thing, as it never left the boy's side. It was a miracle that he could read, let alone find time to read as often as he did. She noticed she was getting lost in thought again.
"A nasty habit," she thought. "If I get caught, I'd lose my job sure as the sun rises."
Mrs. Lentley dismissed all thought of the boy and the book and began her job of cleaning up the room. Jim spit out the water from his mouth, finished his daily routines, and headed down the stairs to breakfast, refusing to let anyone see how rough his night had been. He refused to let his past influence how he acted now, and being a genuinely good-natured kid, quite honestly succeeded. Reaching the second floor, the accursed girls' floor, Jim turned to go down the next flight and almost ran into Peter at the landing. The young boy was Jim's bunkmate. At 4 years old, Peter usually had a dopey grin underneath his mop of ginger hair. This time, however, Peter was staring off into space. "Come on then, Peter, we're going to be late. Goodness knows neither of us want a beating." Jim urged the young boy forward as he spoke, but Peter seemed cemented to the ground. Suddenly, Peter spun around, throwing Jim on his back to the floor, quite the feat for someone as small as Peter was. Jim began to scold the boy, being extremely surprised, but stopped as he saw the glazed look over Peter's eyes. Peter then spoke, but the voice wasn't his. It seemed too old. "It is coming," the voice wheezed out of Peter's lips. And then, as if Jim had imagined it, Peter was back to his normal, happy self.
"Hey, Jim, you ready to eat?"
Peter grabbed Jim's hand, and before Jim had a chance to reply, tugged him onto his feet and down the stairs. "Absolutely," Jim replied tenuously, but he couldn't help but stare incredulously at his friend. But remembering his breeding, forced himself to stop. After all, one definitely didn't want to be caught gaping while Mrs. Cratchit was around. Upon entering the dining hall, Jim paused to take in the familiar view. The room was on the main floor across from the entrance. Above the door, according to the crab, as the children liked to call Mrs. Cratchit when she wasn't around, nice, spiffy lettering was a sign simply stating, "Food." Above the door, according to Jim, was the most dingy, pathetic sign, still simply stating, "Food." Jim and Peter stepped inside the lunchroom to be greeted by the ordinary sight of nice, orderly rows of tables and chairs on one side, while the other side was completely empty. Naturally, according to the laws, rules, regulations, etc. of Cratchit's home for disparented youngsters, the girls got the tables and the boys, well, didn't. On the far side of the room was the door to the kitchen, and in stark contrast to that door sat the pristine, distinguished office of Mrs. Cratchit, with her looming shadow ominously present, yelling at some poor boy. It was always a boy getting yelled at. Jim heard the girls got a slice of cake. Peter and Jim took their customary places standing behind two empty chairs and waited for the girls to get their slop, walk to the chairs, have the boys pull them out, sit down, and start eating, all without saying a simple thank you. After the girls, it was time for, as the crab said, the lesser of the sexes to get their food. The boys followed through the line at the front of the room to get their food from Mrs. Cratchit's son, the chef. Chef was a good-natured, dark-haired individual, but had an impressively dry sense of humor inversely proportional to the wetness of the food he served. Slowly but surely, Jim made it to the front of the line and said, "What's it to be today, Chef?"
"Well, me boy, here at Crab's Home for Yadder-Yadders, we only serve the finest sludge," Chef replied, heaping a big pile of brown goop in a bowl for Jim. Then, handing Jim the bowl, Chef followed with an, "Enjoy. Oh, and me mum's in a right nasty mood today. Best tread lightly round the leader of the superior gender." Jim grinned as he took his food back to his customary spot on the floor away from the other boys, and began his customary sit, dread what the food would taste like today, and procrastinate eating a little longer. It was a good routine. Worked every... Jim's thoughts were interrupted when the door to the crab's office slammed open, producing the horrid monstrosity of Mrs. Cratchit following close behind. Her big, meaty claws held a cowering boy, Charles, nearly 6 years old, and quite terrified in their grasp. And for good reason, Jim thought. Seeing the crab every day was always a new experience, given the ridiculous outfits she was prone to wear, today being a bright pink dress flowing down to her feet with an extremely high neckline, but so tight Jim wondered how she could even move and or breathe. But some things were always the same. Mrs. Cratchit was, to put it lightly, hefty. Her big, meaty claws were followed by meatier arms, and the rest of her was a blob of fat that seemed to have no end. Her head melded perfectly with her neck, but the crab's skin was so tight that she had absolutely no wrinkles. Jim, ever the aspiring entrepreneur, quickly jotted the idea down in his mind that the fatter someone was, the less wrinkles they would have, but again was so rudely cut off by the crab's wonderful personality. While Mrs. Lentley was an angel, and most certainly never a girl, Mrs. Cratchit most definitely was.
"And let that be a lesson to all of you boys,"
she bellowed in utter disgust.
"I expect you arriving right on time. Not late, not early, right on time."
She separated those last 3 words for dramatic effect, though from the "yes, ma'am" scattered throughout the orphans, the point had gotten across long before she had even started to talk. Jim thought he saw the slightest inkling of a smile come across Mrs. Cratchit's face, but he shrugged the thought off, for the crab never smiled. Jim glanced again to check, but quick as it came, it left, and with its leaving came more pleasantries.
"And what are you lot staring at?" she boomed. "Back to your food. My son prepared it especially for you."
She finished that last little bit with a sneer towards Chef, turned on her pudgy ankle, and stormed back into her office. The room was unnaturally quiet for a few agonizing seconds until everyone remembered that this was a common routine and went back to their sludge. Jim finally spooned the food into his mouth, chewed, swallowed, had it come back up, and swallowed again. Gagging food down was also a common occurrence in the orphanage, but Jim was impressed because every day the food seemed to get worse. That's why he called Chef Chef. Only one so talented as a gourmet chef would be able to make something worse every day. Jim spooned another bite and brought it to his lips, ready to savor the disgusting flavor, and paused. Just before the nauseating flavor touched his tongue, he noticed something that made him drop his spoon and spill sludge all over himself. Across the room stood, Jim could hardly believe his eyes, a girl. The girl had shoulder-length brown hair that was completely soaked, dripping water constantly that never seemed to make it to the ground. Her dress was the same, completely drenched. Her eyes were a deep blue, close to black, and seemed dead, yet they were staring straight at him. Her expression was full of fear, and water kept seeping from her partially open mouth. Suddenly, her voice rang through every part of the raucous lunchroom, though her mouth didn't move. "James, help me." As soon as she said those words, she floated from the room into the main lobby area. Jim jumped to his feet and ran after the phantasm. No one stopped him. If they tried, they'd only get a beating from Crab, too. Jim chased the ghost, terrified and excited simultaneously, out the lunchroom door and up the stairs. The drowned girl kept floating away just out of reach, and Jim thought he could still hear her voice in his mind, repeating over and over, each time getting more desperate, more frantic. He kept running up the stairs, skipping a few here and there, failing to notice Peter following him, and the sound of rain slowly echoing each of his footsteps. When he finally reached the third-floor landing, the sound of rain outside had reached tumultuous levels, and he watched helplessly as the girl floated up, then let loose a shriek of pain which racked her body. Jim slammed his hands over his ears and watched in horror as the girl arched her back, whimpering one final time, and began to rain. Droplets of water spilled from her like a thundercloud releasing its burden, taking with them, drop by drop, parts of her body, until she finally disappeared, leaving nothing but a puddle in her stead. Jim ran towards the puddle, completely intrigued and yet a little uneased by what he would see. He didn't realize that with each step the rain got a little heavier. Peter also evaded Jim's gaze as he finally caught up, completely oblivious. When Jim got to where the puddle was, he leaned over it and began to stare into it. He was entranced by how deep the puddle seemed to be. He felt that he could see to the bottom of the ocean itself. And with the writhing the puddle seemed to be doing, the ocean seemed troubled. A bright flash of lightning shone through the halls of the orphanage, illuminating the run-down building in an eerie white light. During the split second the lightning shone, everything changed. Though the building was the exact same, everything seemed more transient, more volatile, more liquid. Jim readied himself to sink into the floor when he found his bearings once more. He turned to go back to the safety of the other children and noticed Peter, limp, pale, and rocking back and forth like a boat on the seemingly solid floor. Jim ran as fast as he possibly could towards Peter, picked up the young child in his arms, and began to sprint to the only potentially safe place he could, the lunchroom. That's when he heard the roar. At first he thought it was thunder, but then it didn't stop. He slowed his sprint and looked over his shoulder at the staircase when he noticed the source of the deafening noise. A gigantic waterfall crept down from the 3rd floor, going down each staircase meticulously, somehow keeping its shape while tumbling over itself in a manically controlled plummet. The destructive force was holding itself back, writhing against gravity itself. When it hit the 2nd floor, the water sent a chute into the girls' room, seeming to search for something. The chute was a neck, and at the end of the neck, Jim saw it, the creature of his nightmares and of his reality, the head of the horse. The horse head apparently didn't find what it was looking for there, and it bellowed in indignation, and then proceeded to form back with the water and head to the 1st floor, straight towards both Peter and Jim. The noise was deafening now to Jim, both to his ears and to his soul. He was filled with an immense dread, but he had a duty to protect his friend. Jim changed his course to the front door of the orphanage while the water crept down the last set of stairs towards him. His limbs felt heavy and his pace slowed as he approached the door. With every step, the door seemed to get further away, the water closer and the roar louder. The horse head probe protruded from the mass of water and started its search around the room, sniffing for its prey. Jim froze when he saw the head come towards him. The horse head sniffed his face, soaking Jim completely, and then bellowed, recognizing its prey. The water began to creep inside every opening of his face, from his nostril to his mouth. Blackness began to overtake his vision, and Jim knew it was the end. His last sight was an extremely large woman barreling towards the water ferociously. And the last thing he heard was an unearthly shriek as the horse reeled back in terror.
And that was amazing, wasn't it?
I thought so. I mean, not to toot my own horn.
Now, we'd like to give a good shout out to the wonderful people who support our podcast, such as the writers who write in and give us their questions.
It was like, the writers, us?
The
We support our podcast.
The people who write in, our spouses, as we mention every week, parents, and everyone else who likes to support us in everything that we do, everything that they do for us, and being our inspiration.
You're the meaning in my life. You're the inspiration.
Let's not get took down.
That's why I only did that much. Thank you. Leaving you with a sound hug.
Both sides.
Yeah, 2 microphones on a sound hug this time.
You get my beard that time.
Yeah, I was doing it too.
All right. Until next time.
Bye-bye.